Welcome back once again, everybody. Today we're going to be continuing our look at the Civil War. In this section, we're going to be moving away from the battlefield for a time and talking about some of the other political developments and especially economic developments that were taking place during the Civil War. The Civil War becomes a significant turning point, not just in regards to the whole slavery issue, but really even other economic concepts as well, sort of with slavery included in there. Part of what has kind of led to this conflict is this whole tug of war between, is the United States going to remain this agricultural, small farm kind of economy, really pastoral kind of economy, or is it going to transform into a modern industrial economy to rival those of Europe? And, those were kind of some of the forces that were already, fighting each other going into this. And the Civil War very much becomes a turning point in that direction, particularly the era after it, really. But the Civil War kind of sets in motion a lot of those changes that will come in the second half of the 19th century. So we'll talk a lot about those economic changes in both the North and the South as well, and how each side is affected by the war and how individuals are affected by the war, and including those that did not actually fight in it, perhaps those that remained on the home front. So we're going to talk by start talking about some of the politics of the war, some of the political issues, some of the political arguments during the war itself, because there were plenty of those. So let's take a look then at some of the issues that Lincoln has to deal with other than just concentrating on military strategy and concentrating on actually prosecuting a war. A big political issue that Lincoln has to deal with, which is related to the military, absolutely. This is 100% a military issue as well, and that is the border states. And if you recall, we mentioned the border states in the previous section, that border states are those slave states that remained in the Union. Not all slave states seceded, several of them stayed in the Union. And of those border states, the most crucial was Maryland. Maryland, of course, being right. Sorry, this map actually shows you how my mouse is going a little bit weird. The map here actually shows you all these yellow states are your border states: Delaware, Maryland. This actually is West Virginia today. That was Virginia at the time. I'll get to that point a little bit later. Kentucky and Missouri. So these are your border states. And Maryland was the most crucial, and the one that Lincoln is the most adamant, absolutely must stay in the Union. It cannot be allowed to secede. And therefore, this is where Lincoln will do some of the more controversial things that he does in his presidency, which for Lincoln is saying something, in order to keep Maryland from seceding. Now, the reason that Maryland was so important and why Lincoln was so fixated on it had to stay in and was willing to do some things that were really quite questionable in order to keep Maryland in is because of its proximity to Washington, its proximity to the nation's capital. If you notice, this is right here between Maryland is right borders Virginia, so it borders a Confederate state. And if you know anything about the geography of the United States capital, Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. is a federal district that sits in between Virginia and Maryland. So it is right smack dab in the middle. Or Washington, D.C. is right smack dab in the middle between the two. Well, Virginia's already seceded. So if Maryland joins them, if Maryland secedes too, then you're going to have the Union capital, Washington, D.C., sitting right smack dab in the middle of enemy territory, which probably wouldn't be a very good idea. So that is why Lincoln is going to do some rather, some would say extreme, and even still, some might even say illegal things in his presidency. Interestingly, Lincoln, not so much, at least I don't think so much out of I'm the president, I get to do whatever I want kind of attitude. Lincoln does significant things to significantly increase the power of the presidency. No other 19th century president does as much to strengthen and enhance and expand the power of the presidency than Lincoln does, and perhaps Jackson. But for Lincoln, I don't think not so much like I was saying a second ago, I'm the president, I get to do what I want. It is this is a war, desperate times call for desperate measures, and I will do whatever I have to do in order to make sure that the Union succeeds and that the Union survives. But having said all of that, let's look at what he did in Maryland to try to keep it from seceding. And I think you'll see why these became quite controversial, and some would even say illegal. But Lincoln says, doesn't matter, it's a war. I can do things that are illegal if I need to. One of those is he suspends something called the writ of habeas corpus. So he suspends the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland. Now, writ of habeas corpus, this is one of these fancy legal words, these Latin words that we use in our legal system. Writ means a right. Habeas corpus, if you look at the word corpus, it kind of sounds like corpse, like a body. Literally translated, this means something kind of like, why do you have my body? In other words, why am I being arrested? So the writ of habeas corpus is your right to be charged. This is the whole, you can't be charged, or you can't be arrested and detained for a certain period of time without being charged. You can't just be thrown in jail, and not be given a trial, not be charged with anything, all that kind of stuff. That is the writ of habeas corpus. So with the writ of habeas corpus suspended in the state of Maryland for the duration of the war, that meant that people could be arrested, not charged with anything, not given a trial, and just thrown into prison. And the reason for this was so that they could arrest and therefore silence Confederate sympathizers, people that were supporting secession, people that were supporting openly that the Maryland should join the Confederacy. So those people could be arrested and not charged with anything, because obviously to arrest them for that would be a violation of their First Amendment rights. But this allows that to be silenced. And you can see how that would be rather controversial, because the Constitution does sort of imply that the president has some special wartime powers, but it does not specify what those are. And it certainly doesn't say that the Constitution can suspend a fundamental right like habeas corpus. But again, Lincoln's perspective was this is what was necessary in a war. And as commander in chief, he exerted the power to do these things. He also, in Maryland, declares martial law. Martial law, some of you may be a little bit more familiar with that one than the writ of habeas corpus. Martial law essentially means military rule. So it means that self-government is suspended, or it could mean that, and it means essentially a military occupation. So Maryland is sort of on like military lockdown during the war. Military occupation, their legislature is suspended, a lot of their self-government is suspended, because Lincoln doesn't want the legislature meeting and voting for secession. He doesn't want, too much of that going on, or really any of that going on, so that they don't go to the Confederacy. Now, the military presence in Maryland is really more symbolic than anything, because they needed most of those troops elsewhere. But nevertheless, he extends martial law over the state of Maryland. So you can again see how that would be quite controversial, and cause a lot of people to be very angry and feel like Lincoln was a tyrant and was overextending his power and those kind of things. But for better or for worse, it does work, and Maryland will not secede, though it does get Lincoln a whole lot of heat and a whole lot of flack. We tend to think of Lincoln as being a rather popular president, because he is certainly one of the more popular ones now. But we should remember that during his presidency, he had to deal with a great deal of criticism, and people that not only did not like him, but really saw him as as a tyrant in a way, kind of a dictator. That would have been probably a minority view. Okay, but again, remembering that not only is Lincoln being criticized, but the war itself is criticized. There are certainly a lot of people within the North, or in the northern states in the Union, that didn't support the war. And the same would be true of the Confederacy as well. There were those that didn't support secession. There were those that did not agree with the Confederate government, that remained loyal to the Union. There were absolutely pro-Union Southerners. In fact, going back to that map that was on the previous slide, that's where we get the entire state of West Virginia. The western counties of Virginia did not agree with secession. And so when the rest of Virginia seceded, they claimed not to, and that eventually becomes a new state, West Virginia. So there was divisiveness on both sides. So there is opposition to the war in both the North and the South. We're going to focus right here for a moment on that opposition in the North. Those that either sympathized with the South, that agreed that they did have a right to secede. There were those that just kind of said, well, let them secede. Who cares? Shouldn't be fighting a war over it. And there were certainly lots of disagreements in the North about what the war was for. We kind of looked at that in the first section, or the purpose, the goal of the war, and disagreement over that. There were plenty of people that would say, we support a war in favor of, or a war that is to preserve the Union, but did not support a war that was meant to end slavery. And then you had others that said, the war is pointless unless you are making ending slavery a goal of the war. So there were a lot of different reasons why people disagreed with the conduction of the war, the reasoning behind the war, or just the war altogether. There are other things happening during the war that lead to further controversy and further outcry against the war. One of those being conscription. Conscription is a fancy word for the draft. Okay, so it's a drafted military service, so the institution of a draft where military service was basically required, and you could be drafted into the military. This is used in both the North and the South, so both the Union and the Confederacy will rely on conscription as a means of filling up their military, making sure they had enough people to fight. But this always causes controversy because nobody likes to be forced to do anything, and forcing people into military service, forcing people to fight and die potentially for a particular cause without their willingness to do so, that's always going to be something that causes controversy. So there will be demonstrations against conscription, particularly in the northern states. There would even be riots in some places against conscription, in the free states, in the northern states, in the Union. So this one does cause a significant amount of trouble and could have potentially really undermined a lot of Union efforts because of the controversy over conscription. A lot of times, some of the controversy is also not just about conscription, but about the fact that you could actually buy your way out of it. You could pay a fee of several $100s, which was a lot more money back then than it is now, but you could pay a fee to get out of conscription and sort of pay someone else to go in your place. You could hire a substitute. So obviously that favors the wealthy. So that was and still that would be a similar argument made of conscription even in the 20th century, is that things like you can't pay substitutes anymore, but something like going into college can get you out of the draft. So, that tended to favor wealthier families that could afford such a thing. So that becomes a big issue in both the North and the South. So conscription becomes quite controversial. Now, of the peace movements or the anti-war movements in the Union, one we should mention were the Copperheads. The Copperheads, these are peace Democrats in the Union. So these are Democrats that supported or that did not support the war. But by calling them Copperhead, or rather by calling them peace Democrats, it kind of makes us see more like 20th century sort of, peace and love kind of things. People that just wanted peace and did not want to fight. That's not the case. It's not that they're just opposed to war in general. They're like hippies or something. They simply just didn't want the war because either they sympathize, really. They are downright close to Confederate sympathizers, or as close to Confederate sympathizers as you can be. So they are those that don't just not want to fight or think that this is too expensive or whatever. They agree with the Confederacy that they have a right to secession. They do not want to fight a war to end slavery. Perhaps they agree that slavery is a constitutional right, those things. So the Copperheads are rather dangerous because they border on subversiveness. It's not just opposition. It could be argued that the Copperheads kind of bordered on treason in some ways, or at least some of the more extreme ones did. So that was a particularly dangerous and potentially one of the more dangerous forces and one of the more dangerous forms of opposition for the Union, potentially very, very threatening. Opposition to the war could also come from some of the very people that were supportive of the war and from people in Lincoln's own party. So all of this, the Copperheads, you're talking about Democrats that are not people of Lincoln's own party, but even people in Lincoln's own party could sometimes be opposed to the war. We need to introduce a group that we'll talk about a lot, particularly when it gets to the Reconstruction era, and those are the Radical Republicans. Radical, of course, meaning extreme. So the Radical Republicans are those extreme Republicans, the extreme wing and the more radical, therefore, wing of the Republican Party, or in this case, the abolitionist wing. The Radical Republicans are oftentimes those that were downright abolitionists, not just free soilers like Lincoln, not just, the slavery thing's not very good, but there's not much we can do about it. These are the hardcore abolitionists. Slavery is wrong. Slavery must go. It must go everywhere. It's a sin. It's a crime. All of those things. They were really quite a minority, but they are growing in power throughout the war. and particularly once the war's over with, we'll see them grow in power significantly. But the radical Republicans could cause a lot of problems for Lincoln too. So these are people in his own party, but they're oftentimes very frustrated with Lincoln, very angry with Lincoln, particularly when he is so hesitant to bring slavery into it. You know, and at this point in the war, Lincoln is saying over and over and over again, this has nothing to do with slavery. This is not about ending slavery. He even says something to the effect of, if I have to expand slavery in order to preserve the Union, I'll do it. Now, that was probably hyperbole, but, you know, the radical Republicans are really frustrated and angry with him when he refuses to, or at least is rather hesitant to make slavery an end, a goal of the war. The radical Republicans say, there is no point in having a war. A war is fruitless and pointless if it does not have a higher purpose. And if we do all of this and leave slavery intact, then it is worth nothing. The Union is not worth preserving if we do not take this opportunity to attack slavery along with it. So Lincoln has a lot to deal with. He is not just dealing with the stress of trying to be commander in chief in a civil war and all those other things, but he's dealing with a lot of opposition and a lot of people that are standing against him, you know, from his own side, even from within his own party. Now, we should also take a moment to look at some of the individual experiences in this war, or how this war affected certain groups of people, particularly African Americans, because they have a very important role in this whole process, in this whole conflict, and experience, of course, massive change because of it. So, one of the things we looked at in the previous section was the Emancipation Proclamation, and we talked about how the Emancipation Proclamation changed the war, how it really did not free anyone, at least not immediately, and that wasn't really its purpose. Its purpose was to bring ending slavery into the war, to make that a goal of the war, which it did. But another effect that it had was it did lead to African American service in the war. One of the provisions, actually, of the Emancipation Proclamation that we didn't mention at the time was the Emancipation Proclamation did allow, or it meant that African American enlistment in the Union Army was going to be allowed. So this allows, and they can join the Union Army, or African Americans can join the Union Army as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. So we do see official African American service in the military for the first time since the American Revolution. Now, this is in the Union Army. The Confederate Army will not really use African Americans in their military until the very, very end. And even then, it's not like they're enlisting them as soldiers. They're not giving them a uniform and assigning them a rank and officially enlisting them. They would more like commandeer them. What's the word I'm looking for? Sort of like conscription. Sort of enforce them into service, essentially, for like manual labor. So it's much different in the Confederate side. But so we're going to look at the Union side. And there are thousands of African Americans that serve in the Union military. There's probably about 180,000 or so more that serve in the Union Navy, many of which were free before the war. Probably the vast majority of African American soldiers in the Civil War were previously free. Now, some of them may have been born enslaved, but there were those that were enslaved people that ran away, that ran away and joined the Union Army, or as the Union Army begins to invade Southern territory, their ranks will include more and more slaves that, as they come through, slavery sort of starts collapsing and they join the Union Army and all of that. So many of them are refugees, but many are also free. African American service, though, does come with some pretty harsh realities as well, because although African Americans are allowed to enlist in the military and to fight, that does not mean that they are being treated equally. That doesn't mean that they are being accepted equally. And that doesn't mean that they are receiving the same kind of respect and the same kind of benefits that white soldiers would. For one thing, African Americans did fight in segregated units. So the military is racially segregated. Although it does allow African American service, it is racially segregated, and it will remain racially segregated actually until the 1950s. So African Americans fought in specific African American regiments. The 54th Massachusetts is an example of an African American regiment in the Union Army in the Civil War. It's probably the most famous example. There were plenty of others, but this is the one that probably becomes the most famous for not only for their particular acts of heroism, for the many engagements that they were involved in. They become very well known. It has also been the subject of a lot of more popular sorts of pop culture sort of things. For example, the movie Glory from the 1980s. If some of you have seen that, that was about the 54th Massachusetts. So they've also become famous for some of those sorts of things. But there were many others. Now, there were, of course, as well as having to serve in segregated units, there were other kinds of racial discrimination that occurred in the military. Lower pay, for example. African American soldiers were not paid the same as as white soldiers of their exact same rank. So they did not get the same pay and benefits. They oftentimes had more limited roles. It was common for African American soldiers to not be put on the front lines based on these racist beliefs at the time that African American soldiers couldn't fight as well, that they were not as intelligent, that they were not as adept to fighting, and so that stuff should be left up to white soldiers if at all possible. So they are oftentimes, while they do absolutely see combat, particularly as the war goes on, but they are oftentimes regulated to supply duties, to cooking, to digging ditches, manual labor. And not to say that those things are not important, because they're absolutely important. You know, your infantry and your foot soldiers and all those people wouldn't be successful in what they were doing if it weren't for the people in behind the scenes doing all of that. So I don't mean to say that that work wasn't important, but it was also seen as, okay, this is the stuff that really they ought to be doing, because they shouldn't be fighting on the front line. So that is the case for them. But also, they're not allowed to rise to higher ranks. African American soldiers are not going to be rising to ranks of colonels and things like that, certainly not generals. And these segregated units like the 54th Massachusetts, while they are all African American units, they are commanded by white officers. So they're not allowed to serve in command positions, and they are going to be commanded by white officers. And of course, this doesn't even begin to speak to just basic discrimination, just people being not treated respectfully, unkind words or very offensive words or things like that. And there are issues, or there's instances in battle where Confederate soldiers did not treat African American regiments with the same kind of respect, and actually really just refused to acknowledge the rules of engagement when it came to African American soldiers. There were incidents of African American soldiers attempting to surrender, and Confederate soldiers would not allow them to surrender. According to rules of engagement, if someone says, "I surrender," you stop. You can capture them. They're yours to capture, but you don't just keep shooting at them. And they just kept on just slaughtering them until pretty much they were all dead, because they did not respect them and just probably had just some sort of anger. They refused to exchange prisoners. There were things that they refused to do and refused to really obey the rules when it came to African American soldiers than they did for white soldiers. So some of that discrimination is also coming at them, of course, from the Confederate side. So let's take a look then at the wartime economies and how both the North and South fare and change, economically speaking, as a result of the Civil War. Because overall, to put this very, very, very simply, is that the Southern economy by war's end is falling apart, and it is arguably their absolute worst weakness, biggest, most glaring weakness, whereas the economy is the Union's greatest strength, and it results in growth, expansion, and even a more powerful and more stronger economy, well on the road to a second massive wave of industrialization, becoming the world's leading industrial power as a result of some of the changes that start happening during the Civil War. But let's begin with the Confederate economy. As we've already said, the Confederate economy is arguably one of their worst weaknesses. One of their biggest weaknesses is that their economy is overall just not equipped to fight a war like this. It overall suffers because of the war. It was already weaker and already not equipped to do this task when the war breaks out, and by the time the war is over, it is suffering and falling apart at the seams for a lot of reasons. As we know, the Confederate economy is overwhelmingly agricultural. Therefore, it lacks the financial and the industrial capability to fight a modern war, to fight a war that demanded, mass production of weapons, mass production of uniforms, mass production of food and other supplies, of naval vessels, and their economy just simply can't do it. And that leads to all kinds of shortages. There are food shortages, there are supply shortages, there are lots of again, we tend to go, okay, they're agricultural, they can grow their own food, but most of that agriculture is in cotton. Most of that wealth is tied up in cotton. And therefore, it just cannot switch over. Now, they do amazing things. They did a lot of attempts to transition to agricultural products, to growing food, staple crops for food and sustenance, but it just isn't enough. It just isn't enough to actually make it work for an entire population of people. So the blockade on the water is limiting their supplies as well. So they don't have military supplies. They're running short of food. And it's not just military supplies, but clothing and shoes and medicine. There are bread riots in some southern towns where people are actually rioting over the lack of food and all of that. There is malnutrition. There is starvation because of that. And all of that not only makes it difficult for their military to keep up because they don't have the supplies to handle it, but it also, that's just very devastating to morale. It's hard to keep people in it, and it's hard to get people supporting a cause when there is no food, when there is no medicine, when people are suffering. They will be more likely to give up, which the South holds on for a pretty darn long time, despite all of those things. But it overall just cannot sustain them. So we have all of that, which is very, very devastating to morale. As far as the financial situation is difficult in both North and South, but the South, with its much weaker economy, that's a much more problematic thing. In both the North and the South, you're going to see the printing of paper money to try to compensate for the money shortages. But in the South, in the Confederacy, that printing of paper money did far more economic damage than it did in the North. So they are printing massive amounts of paper money, which of course leads to inflation. Whenever you're going to put more money out there, whether you're printing paper money or whatever, when you put money out there, that causes inflation. That causes prices to rise because that value of the money goes down. So we see rising prices. But the thing is, in the Confederacy, it just gets out of control. That paper money being printed is done so recklessly. It's done by individual states that do this. They just kind of have not because they don't care, but because they just really don't know what else to do. It's done kind of recklessly, and therefore the inflation is just very much out of control. And Confederate paper money is essentially worthless by the end of the war. One, because they printed so much of it, and secondly, because it's backed by a government that doesn't exist anymore by 1865. So that's going to mean a lot of people are just financially ruined as a result of the war. Now, one way that the Confederate economy tries to keep up, and one way that they try to pay for all of this, is through war bonds. And these have been used plenty of times in wars before. These were used in the Revolution. They were used lots of different times. War bonds, are when you buy a bond, basically, loaning the government your money that they will use to pay for the war. And the idea is you get paid back once everything is over with interest. The thing is with war bonds is that a lot of people in the Confederacy invested a lot, maybe most or even all of their money in war bonds. But those are going to be worth absolutely nothing by the time the war is over, because the Confederate government ceases to exist. And so you can't be paid back for a bond from a government that doesn't exist anymore. So that's going to mean some people are financially ruined, and it's going to mean a lot of the wealth in the South will be wiped out as a result of the war, and a lot of people will be in poverty. And overall, another thing that we have to remember when it comes to the home front in the South is that the home front is the battlefront. The vast majority of Civil War battles are fought on Southern territory. This means that people are right there in it. These battles are being fought in their lands, in their homes, in their cities, in their towns. They are facing invasion, and some of them will experience invasion and destruction throughout the war, depending on where they were. So people are fleeing. People are fleeing when they hear that the Union Army is approaching or that a fight is coming near them, and that leads to a lot of people being refugees. There are thousands of people fleeing, and leading to homelessness. People that are just kind of just trying to get away. That leads to a breakdown of law and order in a lot of places. You have so many people off fighting, and these home guard governments that sometimes struggled to, keep law and order. So there was high crime, and people were afraid, and there's looting and all kinds of things. There's refugee slaves as well as refugee non-slaves, as people are just, walking off of slaves are just walking off of properties as slavery crumbles, sort of one at a time. The Union Army, as you get past 1863, 1864, the Union Army is coming through, plundering, destroying. There's violence. People just live in fear, and there's just also this psychological destruction or psychological devastation of people having committed themselves so fully to a cause and then seeing that cause just completely obliterated and their whole world just sort of crumbling around them. That had to be something that was scary and something that was demoralizing. So there is that whole just really, really depressing kind of situation that you have in the South that you don't really have in the North, because the war, for the most part, isn't being fought there. It's being fought elsewhere. And so their people, their citizens, their civilians are not in the line of fire. They're not in the same kind of immediate danger that a lot of people in the Confederacy were. So overall, the war demands a stronger economy. It demands centralized power to take charge of these situations, to say, okay, here's what we're going to do with the money situation. Here's how we're going to handle the food shortages. But the Confederate government, being very committed to the idea of states' rights, just was not ready to do that and did not have the authority to do that. And the Congress didn't have that authority. Davis didn't have the authority, wasn't about to expand his power the way that Lincoln did. And the Confederate government probably would not have allowed that. So those kind of things really lead to a lot of serious problems in the Confederacy, contributing to, but certainly not the only reason for, their defeat. Now let's take a look at the Union economy, where we see sort of a almost exact picture, exact opposite picture, I'm sorry. Almost the exact opposite happening in the Union. There are a few similarities, but overall the Union economy prospers. As we've already mentioned, the Union economy was partly their greatest strength. They have the industry, they have the financial capabilities, and all of those things are actually going to grow and be even more successful and more effective as a result of the war. So we actually see economic growth in the North. We see the growth of industry because the war meant there was greater demand for a lot of industrial supplies. There's demand for weapons, there's demand for ammunition, there's demand for uniforms, for the buttons that go on uniforms, for shoes, for cannons, for ships, well, they're not submarines yet, but these what they call ironclads. It's sort of the precursor to submarines. All those things are in high demand, and so that means the growth of industry. That means that businesses are going to be expanding. That means that factories are going to be, converting to wartime production. It means that there's opportunity for more factories to grow. Lots of money to be made, and a lot of people get rich off of the war. A lot of people make a lot of money off of the war, although some are ruined as well. We also see in the Union the growth of mechanization. Mechanization, the word there close to mechanizing machinery. We're seeing new technology, the growth of new technology and new machines to speed up production. And so this is one of the ways that industry is able to grow. You have new technology, new innovations, mechanization. That means that production can be faster, it can be more efficient, and therefore more profits can be made. It makes it less expensive and therefore higher profit. So that's another reason for that industrial growth. And the North is relying more and more on mechanized production rather than individual hand labor. We also see in the North during the Civil War years a whole kind of renewed commitment to the American system that I hope you remember from several chapters ago. Remember, the American system was this really nationalistic program. If you recall Henry Clay after the War of 1812, the American system was this very nationalistic approach, this idea that the national government should be strong, that the economy should be strong, and that the national government should have a role, that it should initiate economic growth, that it should we should have strong federal power here that that enhances business, that is beneficial to business. The government should be enacting policies and pursuing economic policies that create economic growth, that it had a responsibility to do that. And so we see a renewed commitment to that during the Civil War. And part of that has to do with the fact that a lot of things that the Republicans who supported economic growth, a lot of things that they wanted in order to do that, like tariffs and railroads and roads and internal improvements and all those kind of things, those are things that the South typically didn't want and stood against and were a significant block to a lot of those things getting done. Well, during the Civil War, the South's gone. The Southern Democrats are gone. They are not there. They are not there to say no. They are not there to put up a fight. And so that allows the Republicans to really kind of get their way. And that whole pro-union, pro-business, pro-economic growth, pro-railroad pro-tariff whole political agenda can get enacted. They're going to favor things like tariffs and railroads, and they get to have their way with that. So an example of that is we will start to see the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. We have sort of hinted at this idea of a Transcontinental Railroad before. This will be the first railroad to connect East Coast and West Coast. They had been talking about it, planning it, wanting it since the 1850s. But again, the South had kind of been in the way because they didn't support the tariffs to do it and all that kind of stuff. But now there's more of a emphasis and a desire to expand west. We want to expand west so we can access those markets in the west, so we can get those resources from the west, and we need a railroad to do it. So they're actually going to start building the Transcontinental Railroad during the Civil War years. Now, something that is actually similar to the Confederate economy is in the Union, you will see the printing of paper money. They are going to compensate for money shortages and lack of fund in a couple of ways. For one, they're going to pass the very first income tax. They are also going to print money, paper money, just like the Confederacy did. But in the Union, that money has a special name. It's called greenbacks. So greenbacks is the paper money printed by the Union in the North during the Civil War. And that's real easy to remember because if we think about our paper money, it's green, just like this. So the greenbacks are issued. That does cause inflation, as it did in the South, but it's not near as bad. That inflation is kept under much better control in the Union than it was in the Confederacy, so it doesn't cause quite as much of a problem, but it's paper money that is backed by credit. Now, the thing about the greenbacks and the reason why I want to mention them is the greenbacks eventually cause significant debate. And we're foreshadowing here something that is to come. But one of the big issues that's going to spring up after the war is what to do with those greenbacks now that the war's over. You are going to see a side of people that liked the greenbacks, that liked paper money, and thought it was much better to have more money in circulation, more money going around in the economy. And then you'll also have those folks that say, nope, war's over, get rid of the greenbacks and pull them back out of the economy. Those that didn't want that inflation. And that is going to become a serious issue. Probably once the slavery issue is out of the way as a result of the Civil War, the next big one that becomes super divisive is what we call the monetary issue. And it starts with the greenbacks. It's later going to evolve into some other things, but the issue of the greenbacks is coming. So keep that one in mind. Now, another agenda for the Northern government, which now doesn't have the South to bother it for the moment, is westward expansion. Moving west and expanding west and farming the West and settling it and all those things was a big part of their agenda, thus the Transcontinental Railroad and all that kind of stuff. Again, the South was a little bit more hesitant because expansion west was likely a threat to slavery and therefore a hold up to a threat to their political power. But now with the South out of the way, Republicans can move forward with agenda that promotes Western settlement. And so there's two laws that the Congress is going to pass during the Civil War that were designed to promote, to encourage, and to enhance westward settlement. And we'll see these again beginning of next year as well. The first of those is the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act, think about a homestead, means like a place to live. The Homestead Act is designed to encourage western settlement because it offers people essentially free land. It promises free land, essentially the title to land, to anybody that wants to go out there. It promises like a couple of 100 acres to anybody who goes out and settles and claims this land if they improve it. That's the caveat, is they have to, quote, improve it for a total of 5 years, I believe it is. Improve it means do something productive with it, grow crops successfully, ranch and have livestock or something like that successfully, make it economically productive. So it's basically you go out there, you claim some land, do something good and make it work for 5 years and it's yours. You don't have to pay for it. So that's a pretty sweet deal to entice a lot of people to move out west and take that risk. And thousands do go out west on the Homestead Act. So it does lead to a significant amount of settlement out west. And we will look at that again at the beginning of next year, talk about the upsides and the downsides to that. Another one is a law called the Morrill Land Grant Act. The Morrill Land Grant Act is not so much about settlement, but about encouraging agriculture in those areas. The West, as it turns out, you can farm it, but it's kind of hard, to put it very, very mildly and very simply, oversimplifying it. The Morrill Land Grant Act, what it did is it really does a couple things, but It provides land grants to states, which means giving them land out west. Not that it can become part of their state, but so they can sell it. And when they sell it, they sell those land grants, they take the money, and they're supposed to put that money into schools and colleges, agricultural schools and colleges. So essentially, what the Moral Land Grant Act does is it provides money to states that they can then use for agricultural schools and colleges so they can set up education, agricultural education. So the idea was that farmers needed some education too, because people needed to know how to be better farmers. People needed to know how to grow crops successfully. They needed to have skills in animal husbandry and things like that, and that we needed to innovate and improve agriculture. So that's what this law does. And so this law gives the states abilities to set up land grant colleges. And there are many different states, and a lot of states have, and this gets expanded and it's continued on after the Civil War, even then. But a lot of states have colleges that we're at today that were actually started as land grant colleges under the Moral Land Grant Act. And actually, the one in Alabama is one that I bet you are all familiar with because it's just down the road from us. Auburn was actually started as the land grant university out of the Moral Land Grant Act as an agricultural school to provide training and experimentation and things like that for farmers. So it has to do with trying to improve the agricultural output that could be done in the West. So overall in the South, life is pretty tough. Now, life is tough in the Union too, but overall they fare a lot better. And a lot of those things that we've just looked at, we will see again when we look at the the later part of the 19th century. We will once again look at westward expansion, results of the Homestead Act, results of the Moral Land Grant Act, and the continued growth of agriculture in those areas. So next time we will be getting back to the battlefield and seeing what is going on there, seeing some big turning points and the tide of the war changing.